There is a detail in the history of education that hides in plain sight. A detail so counterintuitive that when you first encounter it, your brain rejects it as error. A detail that, once you trace its implications, restructures everything you thought you understood about literacy, about how the human mind processes language, and about why the modern education system was designed to produce a very specific kind of reader. The kind of reader who moves in one direction only, left to right, beginning to end, start to finish. A reader who has been trained since their first day of school to process information in a single linear sequence and to treat any other direction as disorder. Before approximately 1875, children in the English-speaking world were taught to read in multiple directions, not just left to right, right to left, bottom to top, and critically, backward, letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence. Children were taught to decode text in reverse as a fundamental component of literacy education, not as a party trick, not as an advanced exercise for gifted students, as the standard method, the expected skill, the thing every literate child could do because every literate child was taught to do it from the beginning. Go look at the primary education manuals from the 1700s and early 1800s. Pull up the New England Primer, the most widely used schoolbook in American history, published from the late 1600s through the early 1800s. Pull up the hornbooks and the spelling primers and the instructional texts that taught generations of American and British children to read. The exercises include reverse reading, backward spelling, mirror text, decoding. The ability to process language in multiple directions was considered not a supplementary skill, but a foundational one. A child who could read forward but not backward was considered partially literate, incomplete, not yet finished with their education. I found this, and I couldn't let it go, because the modern education system treats unidirectional reading as the only reading, left to right, top to bottom, one direction. The idea that children were once taught to read backward sounds absurd to modern ears. It sounds like a waste of time, like a primitive pedagogical method that was rightfully abandoned when better approaches emerged, like something that belongs in the same category as writing on slate tablets and memorizing Latin declensions. Outdated, superseded, progress moved on. This raises a simple but critical question. If bidirectional reading was the standard for over 2 centuries of English language education, what happened in the late 1800s that made it disappear? The official explanation, to the extent that one exists, is pedagogical reform. The late 1800s saw a revolution in educational philosophy. The old methods, based on memorization, recitation, and mechanical skill building, were replaced by new methods that emphasized comprehension, context, and the extraction of meaning from text. Reading was reconceived not as a decoding skill, but as a meaning-making activity. And within that reconception, backward reading was deemed unnecessary. It was a mechanical exercise that didn't contribute to comprehension. It was dropped. Progress moved on. And that explanation sounds reasonable. It sounds like the kind of improvement that education should make. Out with the mechanical, in with the meaningful. Except the deeper I went, the more I found that backward reading wasn't a mechanical skill. It was a cognitive one. And the cognitive function it trained was precisely the function that the new education system needed children not to develop. The silence was deafening. Start with what backward reading actually does to the brain, because neuroscience has caught up to the pedagogical question that the 1875 reformers never asked. And what it reveals is extraordinary. When you read text forward, left to right, in the normal direction, you're using a highly automated cognitive process. The brain recognizes words as shapes. It processes them in chunks. It predicts what's coming next based on context and grammar. Forward reading, in a skilled reader, is almost unconscious. The brain doesn't read individual letters. It recognizes patterns. It skims. It fills in. It takes shortcuts. This is efficient. It's fast. And it means that the skilled forward reader is, much of the time, not actually reading. They're pattern matching. They're predicting. They're running on a cognitive autopilot that processes language at speed by sacrificing the careful, letter-by-letter attention that a beginning reader applies to every word. Backward reading disrupts this automation completely. When you read text in reverse, the brain cannot use its predictive shortcuts. It cannot recognize word shapes in their familiar orientation. It cannot anticipate what comes next, because the sequence is reversed. Every word must be decoded. Every letter must be processed. The brain is forced out of autopilot and into a state of active, deliberate, conscious engagement with the text. And here's what the neuroscience shows about that state. Active decoding, the kind of effortful cognitive processing that backward reading forces, engages both hemispheres of the brain simultaneously. Forward reading is predominantly a left hemisphere activity. The left hemisphere processes language sequentially, linearly, in the direction the language flows. Backward reading recruits the right hemisphere, the hemisphere associated with spatial processing, pattern recognition, holistic perception, and the kind of non-linear thinking that the modern education system has spent a century training out of children. The deeper I went into the cognitive research, the more the old pedagogical practice started to look less like a primitive exercise and more like a bilateral brain training protocol that the 19th-century educators may not have understood neurologically, but that they understood functionally. They could see what it did to their students. They could observe that children trained to read in multiple directions developed a different relationship to text than children trained to read in one direction only. The bidirectionally trained reader didn't just decode faster. They comprehended differently. They saw the text from multiple angles. They processed language as a spatial object, not just a temporal sequence. They were, in a sense, that the modern education system has no framework for valuing reading with their whole brain, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now, look at what replaced bidirectional reading, because the pedagogical reform of the late 1800s didn't just remove backward reading from the curriculum. It replaced the entire model of literacy education with something that served a very different purpose. The old model treated reading as a skill, a cognitive skill to be built through exercises of increasing difficulty, the way a musician builds technique through scales and etudes. The exercises weren't about meaning, they were about capacity. You built the instrument first. Meaning came after, played on an instrument that was capable of anything because it had been trained in every direction. The new model treated reading as comprehension. The skill and the meaning were merged. From the first day, children were taught to read for meaning, to extract content, to process information, to answer questions about what the text said. The mechanical skills, the bidirectional decoding, the letter-level attention, the spatial engagement with text as an object, these were eliminated in favor of a streamlined, unidirectional meaning extraction process that produced a specific kind of reader. A reader who could process information quickly, in one direction, and produce the correct answer to a comprehension question. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the entire educational reform movement of the late 1800s. Because the pedagogical changes weren't happening in a vacuum. They were happening during the same period that keeps appearing in every investigation I pursue. The period of industrialization. The period when every institution in the Western world was being restructured to serve the needs of an emerging industrial economy that required a very specific kind of worker. The deeper I went into the history of educational reform, the more the reforms aligned with industrial needs rather than cognitive development. The factory needed workers who could follow instructions in sequence. Read Step 1. Execute Step 1. Read Step 2. Execute Step 2. Linear, sequential, unidirectional. The assembly line wasn't just a manufacturing innovation, it was a cognitive model. And the education system was redesigned during the exact period when the assembly line was being introduced to produce minds that processed information the same way the assembly line processed material, in one direction, one step at a time, start to finish. A child trained to read in multiple directions is a child whose mind moves in multiple directions. A child who can decode text backward is a child who can approach any problem from any angle. A child who engages both hemispheres simultaneously is a child who thinks holistically, spatially, non-linearly. This child is a terrible factory worker. This child questions the sequence. This child sees the whole system rather than the individual step. This child is, from the perspective of an industrial economy that needs compliant, sequential, task-focused labor, a problem. The bidirectionally literate child wasn't eliminated from the classroom because backward reading was useless. They were eliminated because the cognitive capacity that backward reading developed was incompatible with the kind of mind the industrial economy needed to produce. Here's where I need you to look at something specific. Look at the diagnosis of dyslexia, because the timing is extraordinary and the implications are profound. Dyslexia was first described as a clinical condition in the 1880s. The term was coined in 1887 by Rudolf Berlin, a German ophthalmologist. Before the 1880s, dyslexia did not exist as a diagnosis. Not because the condition didn't exist, because the educational framework that would define it as a condition didn't exist yet. In an educational system that taught bidirectional reading, a child who naturally reversed letters or read words backward wasn't impaired. They were doing what the curriculum expected. Their tendency toward reversal was a feature, not a bug. A starting point for a skill that the education system was designed to develop. The moment the education system switched to unidirectional reading, the moment backward reading was eliminated from the curriculum, the children who naturally processed text bidirectionally became disordered. Not because their brains changed, because the definition of normal reading changed. The curriculum narrowed. The children who didn't narrow with it were diagnosed. The deeper I went into the history of dyslexia, the more the diagnosis started to look less like the identification of a disorder and more like the pathologization of a cognitive variation that a previous educational system had considered normal, a variation that a previous era had trained and valued, a variation that, in the bidirectional classroom, would have made the child not disabled but advanced. Pull up the research on dyslexia and spatial reasoning. Studies consistently show that individuals with dyslexia demonstrate enhanced spatial abilities, superior three-dimensional thinking, and stronger holistic pattern recognition compared to non-dyslexic individuals. The same cognitive profile that makes linear, unidirectional reading difficult makes spatial, multidirectional thinking stronger. The dyslexic brain isn't broken, it's oriented differently. It processes information in a way that the old educational system would have recognized as a skill to be developed and that the new educational system classified as a disease to be treated. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you look at who gets diagnosed with dyslexia. Studies across multiple countries have found that dyslexia diagnosis rates vary significantly depending on the language and the writing system. Languages with more regular spelling systems have lower rates of diagnosed dyslexia. Languages with irregular systems, like English, have higher rates. The disorder correlates not with brain structure, but with the degree to which the writing system punishes nonlinear processing. The same brain that would be dyslexic in English might not be dyslexic in Italian. The disorder isn't in the brain, it's in the mismatch between the brain and the system. I'm not telling you that dyslexia isn't real. The difficulty is real. The struggle is real. The impact on children's lives is real. but I'm asking whether the difficulty is a disorder or a mismatch, whether the children we diagnose and medicate and remediate and label as learning disabled are actually disabled, or whether they're the inheritors of a cognitive orientation that a previous educational system valued and that the current system has no framework for recognizing. I'm asking why children before 1875 were taught to read backward, and children after 1875 were diagnosed as disordered for doing the same thing. I'm asking what cognitive capacity was being developed by bidirectional reading that the industrial education model needed to eliminate. I'm asking why the diagnosis of dyslexia appeared at the exact historical moment when the educational practice that would have accommodated dyslexic cognition was removed from the curriculum. I'm asking what kind of minds the old system was building. Minds that moved in multiple directions. Minds that engaged both hemispheres. Minds that could approach text, and by extension, every problem, from any angle. Minds that the industrial economy couldn't use because those minds wouldn't stay on the assembly line. I'm asking what happened to those minds, where they went, whether they're still here, still being born into bodies that carry the same cognitive orientation, still being sent to schools that diagnose their orientation as a disorder, still being medicated and remediated and taught to compensate for a capacity that a previous century would have trained, not treated. Go find a piece of text, hold it up to a mirror, read it backward, feel what your brain does, feel the effort, feel both hemispheres engage, feel the spatial awareness activate, feel the whole brain processing that the modern education system spent a century and a half training out of you. That feeling isn't confusion. It's a cognitive capacity you were never taught to develop, a capacity your great-great-grandparents developed as children, a capacity that was removed from the curriculum during the exact period when the industrial economy needed minds that moved in one direction only, handed a left-to-right education and told it was the only way to read.